Riley Monroe wasn't looking to be a hero, just another invisible face surviving the cold streets. But everything changes the day she hears a child crying behind a newsstand and finds Ethan, alone, scared, and wrapped in a designer coat that doesn't belong on a street corner. That single moment, one cereal bar, one gesture will unravel secrets, challenge power, and forge a bond stronger than blood. What if the person with nothing becomes everything to someone else? Stay with us because this story proves that even in the coldest places, hope can find a way to burn bright. That freezing morning, Riley Monroe wasn't begging. She wasn't holding up a cardboard sign or calling out for spare change. She was squatting against the red brick wall behind a greasy diner, trying to shield her fingers from the wind as she shook a plastic cup and counted coins, mostly pennies and nickels, a few dimes, one precious quarter, $2.11. It wouldn't buy her much, but she'd stretch it. She always did. Her backpack, worn thin and patched with duct tape, sat at her feet. Inside it, a plastic water bottle half filled with warm tap water, an almost full pack of tissues, her only clean pair of socks, and one cereal bar. That cereal bar, granola with fake blueberries, was supposed to be her dinner. She had saved it from the shelter's donation box 2 nights ago. She eyed it now, hunger pulsing behind her ribs, but she wasn't ready to give in just yet, not until she knew what the day would bring. So she pressed the coins back into her pocket, tucked her fingers under her arms, and tried to disappear into the corner like she always did. The city didn't see her, and most days that was a blessing. She'd started to doze off when a sound caught her attention. Not the usual honking or the distant rattle of the elevated train, but something soft, fragile, a whimper. Her eyes snapped open. It was coming from the closed newsstand across the alley. The metal shutter was down, tagged with old graffiti and gum wrappers, but the sound was clear. Someone was crying. Riley hesitated. Crying usually meant trouble, a trap, a setup. She'd fallen for those before, but this cry was different. It didn't come with footsteps or laughter, just small panicked sobs like a balloon deflating slowly. Against her instincts, Riley stood and approached the stand, moving like a ghost along the alley wall. She crouched and peeked beneath the shutter, her heart pounding. That's when she saw him, a boy maybe 6 or 7, curled tightly into himself, shivering beneath a coat that was too clean, too expensive, too wrong for this part of town. His scarf was half covering his face, and she spotted a fancy W stitched into the edge, a Whitmore coat. Riley blinked. Kids like that didn't end up in places like this. Not unless something had gone very wrong. "Hey," she said softly, crouching lower, unsure if he could hear her. "Hey, kid, ... Are you okay?" The boy looked up suddenly, eyes wide with fear, and scooted further into the shadows. His lip was trembling and his cheeks were flushed from cold and crying. "Don't hurt me," he whispered. Riley almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. She was the one people crossed the street to avoid. She had holes in her jeans, dirty fingernails, and a hoodie that didn't zip up anymore. But she didn't move closer. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. I heard you crying," the boy didn't reply. He kept hugging his knees, his body shaking. Riley looked around. No one else had noticed. No one else cared. She took off her backpack, unzipped the front pocket, and pulled out the cereal bar, the only one she had. She held it out in the space between them. "You hungry?" she asked. The boy eyed the wrapper, then her, uncertain. "It's not poison," she said, cracking a small smile. "You think I can afford poison?" After a long pause, the boy inched forward and took the bar with careful fingers. They didn't speak for a while. The city moved around them, oblivious. After a few more bites, the boy finally spoke. "My name is Ethan." Riley glanced sideways at him. His hair was too neat, his shoes still too clean for a kid on the street. "Riley," she said. "Riley Monroe." Ethan nodded as if that name meant something. It didn't. Where's your mom or dad, Ethan? She asked. He chewed slowly, eyes lowered. I don't know, he said. They were yelling. Then the car door slammed. I ran. Riley winced. She knew what it was like to run. Do you know how to get home? Du stank. It wasn't sympathy that made her stay, it was recognition. In Ethan's hunched posture and cautious eyes, she saw something she hadn't looked at in a long time, herself. Or at least a version of herself from years ago, back when she still believed someone would come looking. Riley leaned her head back against the stand and let out a long sigh. Okay, she muttered. Okay, we gotta figure this out. Ethan looked up. Figure what out? She glanced at him. Where you're gonna go. What you're gonna do. 'Cause trust me, this ain't the place to spend the night. He frowned, cereal bar half-eaten in his lap. Can I stay with you? The words hit her like a slap. She didn't let people stay. She didn't let people close. That's how you got hurt. But something about his voice, not desperate, just tired, made it impossible to say no. For now, she said. Just today. Tomorrow's a different story. Ethan smiled, and it was crooked, uncertain, and genuine. Riley wasn't ready for that kind of smile. Not from someone who still believed in people. She stood and zipped up her hoodie halfway, motioning for him to follow. He grabbed his scarf and adjusted the coat, clearly not used to walking through alleys. She checked both ends of the alley before stepping out, Ethan close behind. Rule number 1, she said as they walked. Keep your head down, don't look anyone in the eye. Why? He asked. Because people look through you, she replied. And that's safer than them seeing you. He nodded solemnly, like he understood more than a 7-year-old should. As they reached the edge of the block, she glanced back at the newsstand, empty again, as if he'd never been there. She didn't know what she was doing, taking in some rich kid who had probably wandered off from a nanny. But she did know what would happen if she left him alone. She couldn't stomach that possibility. Not today. Not anymore. And so, with cold hands and an impulsive act giving him the cereal bar meant for her own survival, Riley Monroe rewrote the story of both their lives. She didn't know it then. Not fully. But something had shifted. It wasn't a rescue. Not really. It wasn't sacrifice either. It was something quieter. He had looked at her not like she was a threat or a mistake, but like she was safe. In that moment she saw what no one ever reflected back to her, that she could matter to someone. Even just one someone. So she kept walking, his small footsteps echoing behind her, and she tightened her grip on the backpack that now felt just a little bit lighter, and somehow, for the first time in a long time, so did her chest. Riley didn't know what time it was. The sky had that sickly gray color that meant either morning was coming too late or night had arrived too early. Either way, Chicago didn't slow down. It moved with blind momentum, as if people feared what might happen if they ever stopped to actually look. Riley moved fast, head down, with Ethan's small hand gripping hers so tight it almost hurt. She didn't shake him off. Not this time. Instead, she guided him through alleys and shortcuts she'd memorized from years of disappearing. Walk like you're invisible, she whispered, crouching beside him as a squad car passed a block away. He mimicked her posture perfectly. Why are they looking for me? He asked. Because they care that you're missing, she replied. That's a luxury, kid. He blinked up at her, puzzled by her tone, but said nothing. As they crossed under an underpass, she paused to wrap one of her spare scarves around his ears. Keep your head down, but not too low. You don't want to look like you're hiding. She was coaching him the way she had once coached herself. It was strange. teaching someone how to disappear when you'd spent your life trying not to exist. They ducked into a half-boarded bus shelter near the edge of Chinatown, waiting for the foot traffic to thin before moving again. Ethan's stomach rumbled loudly, and Riley glanced down. "Didn't the cereal bar help?" she asked. He shrugged. "I was hungry before that." She sighed and rummaged through her bag, pulling out an old vending machine sandwich she'd been saving. "It's tuna," she warned. "Kind of." He took it gratefully and began to eat, sitting close beside her on the cracked bench. "Did you ever get lost when you were little?" he asked through a mouthful. Riley stared at the chipped paint on the bench. "I didn't get lost," she said. "I got left." He looked up at her, eyes wide. "Like, on purpose?" "Yeah," she said flatly. "On purpose." He didn't press her, but his silence was heavier than questions. After a minute he asked, "So, where are we going?" She thought for a second. "Somewhere with heat and chairs," she said, "and maybe a bathroom that doesn't smell like firecrackers." That made him laugh. The sound so sudden and clear that a man walking past glanced their way. Riley tensed until he kept moving. Ethan didn't notice. He was still laughing. The story started when they reached an abandoned storefront next to a closed convenience store, and there was a dry patch behind the building where they could sit without being seen. Riley had no plan, not really, so she made one up the only way she knew how. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a dragon with frostbite." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "Dragons can't get frostbite. This one could," she insisted. "He was old, and stubborn, and kinda dumb. He kept flying into snowstorms because he thought he was invincible." Ethan giggled. "It sounds like a bad dragon." "No," Riley said, adjusting her tone. "He was just lonely. He kept pretending to be dangerous so no one would see how cold he really was." Ethan was quiet for a moment, chewing on that. "Did he get better?" Riley tilted her head. "One day a little boy with a flashlight found him in a cave. The boy wasn't scared, not even a little. He just sat beside the dragon and said, 'You look tired.'" Ethan leaned in. "And then what?" Riley shrugged. "Then, they just stayed there. Two tired things. Not so cold anymore." Ethan didn't say anything after that. He just leaned against her side like it was the most natural thing in the world. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped, but Ethan didn't complain. Riley taught him how to breathe through his scarf and how to hold his hands under his coat sleeves to keep his fingers warm. In return, Ethan offered up a story about rockets, ones that never landed, only kept flying because they didn't want to come down. One of them got tired, he said, so it asked the stars if it could rest. But the stars were too far away. Riley listened with an unexpected lump in her throat. She nodded. "That rocket sounds a lot like someone I know." "You?" he asked. She snorted. "Maybe." He tilted his head. "Do you think stars get lonely too?" She didn't know how to answer that. For a second, she almost said no. Then she looked at his face, honest, waiting, and said, "Yeah. I think they do." They kept talking like that, one story, trading for another, until the city noise began to thin and the night pressed in. When Ethan yawned, Riley knew it was time to move again. "Come on, Starboy," she said, standing. "Let's find somewhere with real walls." They ended up at a 24-hour laundromat just past Roosevelt Road, a place Riley had used before on nights when the shelters were full or when she didn't feel safe enough to sleep outdoors. The place smelled like detergent and tired people. A few machines were rumbling. An old woman snored in the corner with laundry folded on her lap. Riley found an empty bench and motioned for Ethan to sit. "Don't talk to anyone," she warned. "And if anyone talks to you, you don't answer. Just look confused." "I am confused," he said. She smirked. "Perfect." He sat close beside her, curling up with his scarf bunched under his chin. Riley took off her backpack and placed it in her lap like a shield. She watched the door. Always watched the door. "Will we be okay?" Ethan asked, voice small. "Tonight?" "Yeah," she said. "Tonight we'll be okay." After a moment, he rested his head against her shoulder. She flinched at first, surprised. Then she relaxed into it, her body unused to the weight of someone else that wasn't a threat. It was warm, human. He was asleep within minutes. She didn't move. Not for a long time. She didn't want to break the spell. That night, as he breathed softly beside her in the corner of that tired laundromat, Riley stared ahead, unmoving. Her shoulders ached, and her legs were sore from crouching and walking and staying alert all day. But none of that mattered. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost haunting the city. She felt real, present, because someone had chosen to lean on her. Not out of pity, not out of fear, but out of trust. a real, fragile kind of trust that she hadn't thought she deserved. She looked down at Ethan, asleep with his mouth slightly open, still holding onto her sleeve even in his dreams. And she understood something. She was no longer running for just herself. She was hiding someone else now, shielding someone else from the same sharp corners that had cut her. And it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like purpose. She leaned her head against the wall behind her, eyes open, heart steady. For the first time in years, Riley didn't feel alone. It was just past noon when Riley saw Ethan's face glowing above the crowds. His image was plastered across the massive LED screens downtown, his eyes wide in a photo clearly taken from a private album, not a surveillance camera. The caption read, "Missing Ethan Whitmore, son of tech mogul Graham Whitmore." Underneath, the words "Reward nitrogen monoxide?" questions asked. Riley froze in the middle of a crosswalk, nearly causing a cyclist to swerve. She barely noticed. Her stomach flipped. This wasn't just a search. This was a manhunt with high stakes. She looked down at Ethan, who was still holding her hand as they moved through the crowd. "That's you," she said quietly. He followed her gaze and frowned. "That picture's old," he murmured. "They used to make me smile like that." Riley didn't respond. Her mind raced. The anonymity that had always protected her was slipping away. They were being pulled into a spotlight she had spent her life avoiding. And for the first time, she didn't just fear for herself, she feared for him. "We need to go," she said urgently, tugging his hand. "Now." But deep down she knew it was too late. The city had seen them. They ducked into an alley behind a pharmacy, Riley pacing while Ethan sat on an overturned milk crate. "What does this mean?" he asked. She rubbed her forehead. "It means they're looking everywhere now, with money, which means people will care. People will talk." She glanced around. "We can't stay here. We need to move fast." Ethan looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will they take me away?" Riley hesitated. "They're your family, Ethan. They want you back. But I don't want to go back," he said quickly. "I want to stay with you." Her throat tightened. That wasn't part of the deal. This was temporary. This was just survival. But she had known, maybe from the beginning, that it wouldn't stay that way. She crouched in front of him. "Listen to me. If anyone tries to separate us, you don't fight them, okay? Don't scream. Don't run. Let them think they've won, but I don't want to leave you." His eyes were filling with tears. "Promise me." "No promises," she said softly. "Not today." He stared at her like she'd just told him Santa wasn't real. "You're the only one who didn't lie to me," he said. That hurt more than it should have. They made it 4 blocks before the streets changed. Security was no longer subtle. Now it was uniformed, coordinated, robotic. Riley spotted a line of guards entering a train station and knew they were checking every exit. A pair of drones buzzed overhead. She pulled Ethan into a stairwell beside a closed cafe. "We're out of time," she whispered. "We need a miracle." Ethan leaned into her side, eyes darting nervously. "What if I talk to them?" "What?" "No," she hissed. "They'll pull you away so fast your shoes won't touch the ground." "But what if I told them about you, that you're good?" Riley stared at him. "That's not how this works, kid. They don't want the truth. They want headlines." He frowned. "But I'm not a headline." "You are now," she replied grimly. They stayed hidden until a search team passed, then sprinted into a nearby plaza, weaving between people. But there were cameras. There were always cameras. And one of them caught Ethan's coat, the monogrammed W. That stupid coat. Riley saw the guards spot them. "Run," she said, but Ethan didn't move. "Run," she repeated. And still he didn't. He reached for her hand instead. The crowd parted as the guards came closer, armed with earpieces and padded vests. One of them spoke into his collar. Mike confirmed. "We've got the boy." Riley stepped in front of Ethan, her fists clenched, even though she knew she wouldn't win. A dog barked somewhere behind the line. Someone yelled, "Step away from the child." Riley didn't. She stayed where she was, body shaking but rooted like a wall between him and them. Ethan grabbed her hand tighter than ever. "Don't let go," he whispered. "I'm not," she said. And she didn't. Then, in the chaos and the shouting and the barking and the snapping of photos, Ethan did something Riley couldn't have planned for. He stepped forward, looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera and said, voice steady and clear, "She saved me. Daddy, she's my friend." It was like the world paused. A guard lowered his radio. A drone light flickered. Riley blinked. Did he just say, "Daddy"? She echoed, too stunned to think. And then she realized Graham Whitmore wasn't just sending people. He was watching, live, and his son had just said it to him. Reporters started showing up within minutes. Microphones were shoved into Riley's face. "What's your name?" someone yelled. "How long have you had the boy? Did you kidnap him?" Ethan gripped her tighter, stepping in front of her now like he could shield her somehow. "Back off," she said sharply. He's not some zoo exhibit, but the questions kept coming until someone finally yelled over the others. "We have an ID. That's Riley Monroe. She's on the footage from the 24-hour laundromat." Riley felt the name hit her like a slap. Not just a name. Her name, said out loud. In front of cameras. Broadcasted. "Riley Monroe," the reporter repeated. "You're a hero, Riley. How does it feel?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. She had spent so long being no one, being invisible. And now somehow the entire country knew she existed. She met Ethan's eyes. "I didn't save you," she whispered. "Not really." "You did," he replied. "Even if you don't believe it." And then the microphones backed off as an SUV pulled up with blacked-out windows and a sleek logo on the side. The Whitmore crest. Riley swallowed hard. The end had come. But she still didn't know what exactly had ended. And yet even as the doors opened and suits stepped out and new hands reached for Ethan, she couldn't stop hearing his voice from just a few moments earlier. That clear, defiant declaration. "She saved me, Daddy. She's my friend." Words so simple they shouldn't have mattered. But they did. They changed the whole narrative. They forced the world to look again. And they brought her name into the light, not whispered on street corners or written in police files, but spoken, repeated, recorded. Riley Monroe. She didn't flinch when they said it again. She didn't hide. She stood tall, or at least tried to. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a ghost. For the first time, someone said her name on national television, Riley Monroe. Graham Whitmore didn't like delays. He didn't tolerate inefficiency, unpredictability, or anything that disrupted the clean, modular logic of his world. His entire life, from the companies he built to the home he lived in, was a carefully designed algorithm. Decisions were made in data. People were managed like systems, and for the most part it worked. But when his security team brought Ethan home, safe but clinging to a girl with ripped jeans and guarded eyes, something fractured in that system. He watched the footage silently. Ethan refusing to let go of her hand, the way she stepped in front of him when the guards approached. How she didn't flinch even as people shouted accusations. Graham had expected a manipulator, a vagrant exploiting a wealthy child. But Riley Monroe hadn't run, hadn't stolen, hadn't lied. She had simply stood there, tired, protective, and infuriatingly silent. When he finally met her that afternoon, sitting across the long conference table in the security wing, she didn't offer explanations. She didn't even apologize. "Why didn't you leave him?" he asked her directly. Her eyes met his without hesitation. "Because he asked me not to," she said. No performance, no self-pity, just that raw and unapologetically human. Graham wasn't impressed easily, and certainly not by emotion. In fact, he'd trained himself to distrust it. Emotions made you weak. They clouded judgment, invited chaos. But when he looked at Riley, he wasn't sure what to think. She wasn't crying. She wasn't groveling. She wasn't even particularly grateful. She had refused his offer, not once but twice when he tried to hand her an envelope of money. "For food, clothes, whatever you need," he'd said. She pushed it back toward him without opening it. "I already gave him what I had," she said. "That's enough." He leaned back in his chair, watching her as if she were some unknown code he couldn't parse. "Do you understand who I am?" he asked. "Do you understand what kind of situation this is?" Riley nodded. "I think you're a man who thinks everything can be solved with a transaction." That stung more than he admitted. He'd built an empire by turning needs into services, emotions into UX, families into targeted demographics. And here was a girl with nothing, challenging the entire premise. She wasn't being dramatic. She was just telling the truth. And the truth, it turned out, didn't care about titles. Later that evening, after she'd gone, after the lawyers had stepped in and started doing their quiet damage control, Graham sat alone in his home office, staring at stills from the surveillance footage. Riley handing Ethan a cereal bar. Riley guiding him down alleyways with practiced caution. Riley letting him fall asleep against her shoulder. She hadn't taken him. She had protected him. And she'd done it better than the army of professionals Graham had hired for exactly that purpose. That was the part he couldn't shake. Ethan had always been a quiet boy, smart but distant, especially since Angela, Graham's wife, had died. No therapist, no elite school, no child behaviorist had ever managed to draw Ethan out the way this girl had. And it wasn't training. It wasn't money. It was something else. Something unteachable. A kind of instinct Graham had spent his life rejecting in favor of structure. He watched a clip of Riley pulling Ethan back from a street corner just before a car raced by. The way she moved without thinking, only reacting, reminded him of Angela in ways that were impossible to ignore. That terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Later he found Ethan in the playroom building something with blocks he'd long since outgrown. "Hey, bud," Graham said cautiously. Ethan didn't look up. "Is she in trouble?" he asked. Graham hesitated. "No, she's not in trouble. I made sure of that." Ethan finally turned to face him. "Can I see her again?" "That might not be possible," Graham said. "We're trying to make sure you're safe now." Ethan didn't blink. "I was safe with her." That hit hard. Harder than it should have. "She didn't even know me," Ethan added. "And she helped me. She didn't want anything. She just stayed." Graham sat down, unsure of what to say. He'd expected his son to be relieved, maybe even grateful. Instead, Ethan looked disappointed. "She told me dragons get frostbite when they pretend they're not cold," Ethan said. "Do you know what that means?" Graham opened his mouth, then closed it. "I'm not sure I do. It means pretending doesn't fix things," Ethan replied matter-of-factly. "It just makes you colder." Graham was a man of logic, but that line landed like prophecy. It lingered in the space between them, strange, undeniable. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Graham returned to the surveillance archive. He watched the laundromat footage again, this time without skipping. Riley had held Ethan like he was made of glass, her body curled just enough to shelter him from the cold without waking him. She hadn't touched her backpack, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. Just stayed there, guarding a boy she'd known for less than 48 hours. Graham leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. Who was this girl? He had people running background checks. He'd get answers soon. But something told him that facts on paper wouldn't explain what made her do what she did. Her motives weren't in databases. They wouldn't be filed neatly into risk assessments or cost-benefit equations. She had acted out of something raw and unquantifiable. Loyalty, maybe, or survival. Or both. He pulled up a still image of her face. Not pretty in the way tabloids preferred, not polished, but real. Sharp. Resilient. And beneath the defiance, something else. Exhaustion without surrender. That look haunted him. It reminded him of a time before he built walls made of code and calendar blocks. And so, for the first time in years, Graham Whitmore, man of analytics, architect of calculated outcomes, ruler of all things efficient, hesitated. He didn't issue orders, didn't call for a press team. He didn't erase her from the narrative. He simply paused, thought, sat with the unfamiliar discomfort of not knowing what to do next. Because something in him, something quiet and deeply buried, whispered that maybe, just maybe, Riley Monroe wasn't a mistake in the system. Maybe she was the correction. She had refused compensation. She had chosen the boy. And now, as he stared at a paused frame of her leading Ethan out of danger, Graham began to wonder if the girl had something to teach, not just to his son, but to him as well. They called it a temporary measure, a phrase that sounded clean and legal and not at all like what it truly was. Disorientation wrapped in protocol. Riley didn't argue. She didn't have the words or the energy to push back when the lawyers explained that. For legal reasons, she had to be kept in proximity until the custody process was sorted. Statements were reviewed and public opinion softened. So she was driven, not invited, to the Whitmore mansion. A sprawling estate surrounded by gates and cameras and hedges trimmed too perfectly to be anything but manicured control. As she stepped inside, the scale of it felt surreal. Marble beneath her shoes. Staircases that twisted upward into places she didn't dare look. Art on every wall that probably cost more than she'd seen in a lifetime. But none of it impressed her, made her feel smaller, more exposed, like someone who had wandered into the wrong side of the mirror. Every staff member that passed her, cooks, cleaners, drivers, looked at her the same way. Polite, distant, skeptical. She didn't blame them. She wouldn't trust her either. Still, the weight of their silent judgment stuck to her skin like something she couldn't wash off. She was shown to a guest room, though it might as well have been a museum exhibit. Polished wood floors, silk curtains, furniture that looked too fragile to sit on. There was a bed, of course, large, pristine, untouched. Riley stared at it for a long time that first night before pulling the comforter onto the floor and sleeping curled in a corner, the way she was used to. The softness of the sheets made her feel more vulnerable, not less. They didn't smell like the street. They smelled like lavender and money. She folded the edges beneath her like armor. The next morning, when a maid found her like that and tried to convince her to use the bed, Riley just shook her head. "I sleep better down here," she said simply. It wasn't a lie. Not really. Later, she stood in the dining room, unsure where to sit, surrounded by silverware she didn't know how to use. 1 fork, 2 forks, spoons for things she'd never eaten. When Ethan bounded into the room and plopped down beside her, grinning like this was all normal, she exhaled for the first time in hours. "You're still here," he said happily. "So are you," she replied, almost smiling. Ethan followed her everywhere. Not in the annoying way little kids sometimes did, but with a kind of quiet certainty that unsettled her. If she left the room, he trailed behind. If she tried to find a private corner, he appeared moments later with a puzzle or a toy or a question. She didn't understand it. She didn't deserve it. "Why me?" she asked him once when they were sitting in the garden no one used. "There are better people. Nicer people. You could be with anyone." He looked at her like she was missing something obvious. "Because you didn't leave." It was so simple to him that terrified her. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. She hadn't left. And now that he'd decided she was his anchor, the weight of that was heavier than anything she'd carried on the streets. Graham was barely around during those days, constantly in meetings or behind closed doors, but Riley could feel his eyes on her even when he wasn't in the room. Background checks had already been run. She knew that. But knowing your life had been dissected didn't make it easier to live in someone else's house, especially when it wasn't yours. By the second night, she was exhausted from pretending not to care. She still ate little, still refused offers for new clothes. She didn't trust gifts, not from rich men, not from well-meaning staff. Gifts had strings, and strings had knots. But Ethan was constant. He would slip under the blanket beside her on the floor without asking, mumble something about a nightmare, and fall asleep with his head on her shoulder. He didn't question why she wasn't in the bed. He didn't seem to care. That kind of trust should have felt comforting, but to Riley it felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. "You know I'm not staying, right?" she told him one night when he was half asleep. "They'll figure it out. They'll find someone better for you." He blinked up at her, drowsy. "I don't want better. I want you." She didn't have an answer for that. She just stared at the ceiling, her eyes refusing to close. That was the night she realized she'd stopped running, and worse, she didn't know if she could run anymore. Not without tearing something she wasn't sure could be put back together. On the third day, she overheard 2 staff members whispering near the kitchen. Something about her type, about how long this arrangement would last, about whether she had an angle. "It's all PR," one said. "Rich guilt." Riley didn't respond. She just slipped out and returned to the guest room, shaking, not with anger but with clarity. She didn't belong here. She never would. And if she stayed, eventually Ethan would realize that too. She sat on the floor beside the bed, the blanket bunched in her lap, and pulled a scrap of paper from the desk drawer. It was nothing special, hotel stationery probably, left out for polite thank you notes. But she wasn't writing thanks. She wrote quickly, quietly, the words barely legible through the trembling of her hand. "If I disappear, take care of him." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just the truth in black ink. She folded it once, then again, and tucked it beneath the lining of her backpack, hidden deep in a seam she knew no one would check. It wasn't a plan. It was insurance. A last resort. Because deep down, Riley still believed the same thing she had always believed, that eventually, everything safe gets taken away. And still, despite everything, the distance of the staff, the silence of the walls, the ache of not belonging, Ethan kept choosing her, kept reaching for her hand without asking, kept pulling her back into rooms like she was a part of this world, even when she knew she wasn't. That night, after making sure he was asleep, Riley sat against the wall with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. She was unraveling, thread by thread, and no one even noticed except him. And that made it worse. Because if he saw her, really saw her, then what excuse did she have to keep hiding? She glanced toward the drawer where the paper had been before she folded it, remembering the weight of the pen in her hand. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic, but they were hers. They're true. On the third night, in the quiet of a house that would never be hers, she had written a message no one would find unless she vanished. A note that said simply, "If I disappear, take care of him." Graham had built his life on predictability, on numbers, facts, verified identities. So when it came to Riley Monroe, he did what any man like him would do. He ordered a complete dossier. Not out of cruelty, not even suspicion, but out of necessity. He needed to know who he was letting into his home, and more importantly, into his son's life. Within days, the report arrived. Thick, comprehensive, cold. The pages outlined a life carved out in survival, a nurse mother lost too early to addiction, a shelter fire that scattered the residents like ashes, 5 recorded escapes from foster placements, and 2 academic institutions where Riley's performance had spiked, one in science, the other in anatomy, before she simply vanished. Graham read it all in silence. The data was sharp but sterile. It confirmed facts but revealed nothing about who she was. The pieces didn't add up. If this girl was just another runaway statistic, why did his son, a boy who trusted no one, hold her hand like she was the only safe place he knew? What the reports didn't contain disturbed him more than what they did. There was no mention of how she had navigated life between those official milestones. No records of theft, no gang affiliations, no history of violence. In fact, there were long stretches of complete silence, months and months unaccounted for. Graham had lived long enough to know that when the system doesn't have data, it means the person went so far off grid, even the shadows lost track. But then something strange emerged. Anecdotes. A soup kitchen volunteer who remembered a quiet girl who always gave up her bread for the younger kids. A janitor at a public library who said someone used to leave folded paper cranes in the return bins, all with hand-drawn anatomy, diagrams and handwritten encouragements like "you matter, even if no one tells you." These weren't in the official files. These were fragments, whispers. Proof that somewhere in Riley's chaos she was leaving behind a trail of compassion, not destruction. And that made her even more difficult to categorize. People like her weren't supposed to exist, not in systems designed to overlook them. Graham couldn't stop thinking about it. The contradictions, the blank spaces, the question that no file could answer. How had she taught herself so much? And why had she never used it to escape fully? The answer came unexpectedly. One morning after Riley left early for a session at Northbridge, Graham was helping Ethan search for a lost toy in the mudroom when he found her backpack, tucked behind a storage cabinet. It was open, slightly unzipped. Graham hesitated. He wasn't a man who rifled through personal belongings. But something caught his eye, the corner of a black weathered notebook, its edges frayed, its cover taped together. He pulled it out slowly, cautiously, and sat down on the bench. The first page was filled with dense, labeled sketches of the human skeletal system. Flipping through it, he found more muscular diagrams, circulatory system pathways, organ breakdowns, all drawn by hand. They weren't copied from books. These were studied, practiced, internalized. Notes in the margins revealed questions that med school applicants asked. But Riley had never sat in a formal class. Not once. She had absorbed all of this on her own, on benches and shelters under flickering library lights. Graham turned another page, and this time he stopped. It was a sketch of a child's body, Ethan's size, roughly, with arrows drawn to critical injury points and emergency procedures. The annotations were in Riley's handwriting. Compression timing, triage priority, mobile splint improv options. Graham stared at it for a long time. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't just talent, it was preparation. Practice born of necessity. She had trained herself to know how to help in case no one else came, in case she was the only adult around. And more often than not, she probably had been. He closed the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. His chest was tight, not from shock, but from a dawning respect. A growing understanding that this girl hadn't simply survived. She had taken every ounce of her pain and transmuted it into something useful, something potentially life-saving, for others. That level of empathy, buried beneath grit and guarded silences, was not something you taught. It was something you earned through fire. Graham remained seated for a long while, the closed notebook resting on his lap like a sacred object. He didn't return it right away. He didn't speak about it either. Instead, he carried it with him into his next board meeting, untouched, tucked in his briefcase like a reminder. When people spoke of resilience, they often meant endurance, the ability to take a hit and keep moving. But Riley's resilience was different. She had taken hit after hit and built something with them. Knowledge, kindness, skill. She had prepared for emergencies not because someone told her to, but because she had been one, more times than she could count. And she had decided without fanfare or recognition that she would be the person she never had. He realized that all his systems, his wealth, his reach, his resources could not fabricate what Riley had constructed alone in the margins of society. A human being with integrity formed from nothing but intention and will. He had ordered a file to understand her. But now he felt ashamed at thinking her life could ever fit in folders. And so Graham returned the notebook to its place in her backpack. He didn't mention it when Riley came home. Didn't ask questions. Didn't tell her what he'd seen. Something about the privacy of it, the intimacy of those pages, deserved more than commentary. It deserved silence. Respect. He began to notice other things after that, the way Ethan's anxiety lessened when Riley was near, how the staff stopped looking at her like an outsider and began taking quiet cues from her presence. The house had shifted, subtly but undeniably, and it had nothing to do with his plans or influence. It was her presence, her impact, her truth. A truth that didn't sit in a folder or a background check. A truth that had to be witnessed to be understood. When Graham found one of those notebooks hidden in her backpack, he flipped through it out of curiosity. Then he stopped out of respect. And stayed silent out of compassion. She didn't plan it like a heist. There were no drawn maps, no stolen keycards, no dramatic farewell. Riley just knew. Knew she couldn't stay another day in that house with its soft walls and silent judgment. It had been building quietly, like pressure behind her ribs, a low, persistent ache of not belonging. Every time someone offered her something, a warm meal, new clothes, polite conversation, it chipped away at her. Not because they were cruel, because they weren't. That kindness made her feel like she was betraying herself. She wasn't made for silk sheets or catered lunches or people who looked her in the eye without suspicion. That wasn't her world. Her world was noise and grime and instinct. So when the sky was still dark and the halls were finally empty, Riley slipped on her old hoodie, the one she'd patched herself, and tightened her backpack over her shoulder. No note. No confrontation. She owed no one an explanation, least of all herself. She crept past the kitchen, past the grand staircase, through the side door the staff used during deliveries. The security system was off. Graham must have trusted her. That stung more than it should have. She walked into the pre-dawn cold, not once looking back. Freedom should have felt like release, like that first breath after coming up from underwater. But it didn't. It felt hollow. Every step forward echoed with doubt. Riley's chest tightened the farther she got from the mansion, as if something inside her was unraveling, thread by thread. But she kept going, past the hedges, through the wrought iron gate, down the gravel driveway. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give herself that. She just focused on the walk, counting each step like a lifeline. 22, 45, 73. Then she stopped. Not because she was tired, but because there in the darkness ahead stood a small figure, motionless. It took her brain a second to register the shape. Pajamas, bare feet, a flashlight trembling in a tiny hand. "Ethan," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't move. Just stood there like a statue carved from heartbreak. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice too loud in the silence. "You're gonna freeze." He lifted the flashlight, not pointing it at her, but letting it glow weakly between them. "I thought you'd try to go," he said. "So I waited." Riley didn't know what to say. Her throat closed around all the usual excuses. "This isn't my place. I'm not your family. You're better off." None of them came out. Ethan wasn't accusing her. He wasn't even angry. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that lives deep in your bones. The kind she knew too well. "You should be inside," she murmured. "It's freezing out here." "So are you," he said. That stopped her. He wasn't wrong. She shoved her hands deeper into her sleeves, unsure whether the cold in her chest was weather or guilt. "You don't get it," she said quietly. "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not like you." Ethan tilted his head. "Because I have socks?" That made her laugh, a dry, involuntary sound. "Because you have a future," she said, "and I'm just a glitch in it." He frowned. "Do you think I don't know what alone feels like?" "I know, and I'm not doing it again. Not if I can help it." His voice wasn't pleading. It wasn't a tantrum. It was just true. Plain and steady. And somehow that made it more powerful than any argument. She could have kept walking. She knew that. He wasn't holding her back. There were no guards, no fences. Just one small kid in socks, shivering on gravel, refusing to give up on her. Riley stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his trust pressing down on her more than any chain ever could. She wasn't used to being wanted. Not like this. Not by someone who didn't expect anything in return. "What if I mess it all up?" she asked finally, voice barely audible. Ethan shrugged. "Then we mess it up together. That's not how it works," she said. "That's not real life." "It's mine," he replied. "And you're in it now." That undid her. Not in the dramatic way, no tears, no sobs, but in the quiet, painful kind. The kind where a wall inside you crumbles. and you don't even realize it until you feel the cold air hit parts you thought were dead. She took a step forward, then another, sat down beside him slowly, her legs folding under her like they weren't quite hers. Neither of them spoke for a while. They sat together in silence, side by side on the edge of the driveway as the first hint of morning touched the sky. Riley could feel the cold through the fabric of her jeans, the sharpness of the gravel biting into her skin, but for once she didn't care. Ethan leaned against her shoulder without asking, and she let him. She didn't pull away. She didn't brace herself for betrayal. She just sat there, breathing in sync with someone else for the first time in what felt like forever. There were no answers, no promises, just presence. Just proof that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run every time something got too good. "You should go back inside," she said softly after a while. "You should too," he replied. She didn't argue. Not this time. She just watched the sun begin its slow climb, her chest heavier and lighter at once. Everything still hurt. Everything was still uncertain. But something had shifted, not around her, but in her. A kind of quiet surrender. Not to the mansion, not to the system, but to the terrifying, impossible fact that someone saw her and didn't flinch. And that morning, sitting on gravel beside a boy who refused to let her disappear, Riley finally understood what it felt like to be held in place. Not by force, but by choice. She hadn't saved him this time. She hadn't been the strong one, the clever one, the protector. She had tried to run, convinced that it was the only way to survive, but she didn't make it. Not because she failed, but because someone was waiting. Ethan had waited, not to stop her, just to remind her what it meant to matter. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her silence for once wasn't distance, it was connection. And as the sky brightened and the house behind them began to stir, Riley Monroe stayed where she was. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one saving someone. She was the one being saved. Graham didn't make the offer over a dinner table or during some dramatic heart-to-heart. That wasn't his style. Instead, he called Riley into his home office one afternoon. After Ethan had gone to school and the house had settled into its usual sterile quiet, she entered cautiously, eyes scanning the shelves of books and the massive screen behind his desk. He gestured for her to sit, but didn't wait for her to get comfortable. "I have a proposal," he said. Riley folded her arms. "Is this another envelope of money?" "No," he replied flatly. "It's an investment, but not in you. With you." That got her attention. He opened a folder, handed it to her. Inside were outlines, timelines, budgets, private schooling, one-on-one tutoring, therapy sessions, social integration support, everything tailored to your needs. You'd get to design the track. You decide the pace, the end goal. Riley stared at the papers. It looked too clean, too official. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care?" Graham leaned back. "Because my son cares. And because, whether you believe it or not, you matter. This isn't charity. This is a challenge." Riley blinked, not sure whether to be flattered or suspicious. So she did what she always did when overwhelmed. She said no. She refused without ceremony. Closed the folder, pushed it back toward him, and stood up. "I don't belong in plans," she said. "I'm not some broken thing to be upgraded." Graham didn't argue. He didn't try to stop her as she left the room. But he didn't withdraw the offer either. That night, Riley couldn't sleep. The idea clawed at her mind in a way she didn't expect. Not because of what it offered her, but because of what it implied. A future. A real one. The next morning, she found the folder placed carefully on her bed. No note, just waiting. She opened it again. Looked closer. There were margins where comments had been written in pen, Ethan's handwriting. "Can I visit her classes?" One note read. Another. "Make sure she gets art supplies." Riley rolled her eyes, but she smiled. She spent the rest of the day ignoring the folder and pretending it didn't matter. But it stayed on her bed like a challenge she hadn't yet answered. That evening after dinner, she stood in Graham's office doorway again. He looked up, unsurprised. "So?" he asked. She held the folder but didn't sit. "What if I want to help other kids too?" That was when everything shifted. Graham didn't laugh, didn't condescend. He only nodded once thoughtfully and said, "Then we start a program, not just for you." The sentence landed like a stone thrown into still water. Riley wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but it wasn't yes. She stared at him for a long moment. "You'd do that?" "With the right structure," he replied, already clicking into his tablet. "There are gaps in the system. You'd be the expert. I'd handle the logistics. You'd let me help design it?" "You'd lead it," he said simply. "It only works if it comes from someone who's lived it." Riley didn't know whether to be impressed or overwhelmed. Probably both. "I'm not a social worker," she warned. "I'm not a therapist. I don't have degrees. What you have is lived credibility, Graham replied. And a voice people are already listening to, whether you like it or not. Riley exhaled slowly. She had fought so hard to stay invisible, and now someone was handing her a spotlight. Not to expose her, but to let her guide others out of the dark. The thought scared her more than anything ever had. And yet it felt ... right? It took weeks of planning. Riley hated meetings, the jargon, the spreadsheets, the way people talked in circles. But Graham kept her involved, made sure her voice wasn't just heard but prioritized. Ethan chimed in too, in his own way, drawing logos, suggesting names. It was his idea to call it Northbridge, because bridges help people cross, he said. And because it sounds like something grown-ups would take seriously. Riley didn't argue. She liked the way it sounded. Every part of the project, from the intake structure to the mentorship framework, had her fingerprints on it. She focused on the little things no adult in a suit would think of. Snack policies for kids who hoard food. Late-night counselor availability. First aid kits in every room. These aren't extras, she told Graham in one meeting. These are survival basics. He didn't push back. In fact, he added more funding. She was learning, slowly, how to trust systems, not blindly but actively. The work made her feel grounded in a way she hadn't known was possible. She wasn't just building something for others. She was building something with others, and that changed everything. The first real, tangible moment came when Graham handed her a key. "It's yours," he said. The room, the address, all of it. She looked down at the key in her palm. It was small, silver, unremarkable, and heavier than it should have been. "I've never had one of these," she said quietly. "To a place that was mine." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She moved into a modest but beautiful space above the program's main office. Windows, a desk, a bed that was hers. There were forms to fill out. For the first time, she had an address to write down. A legal residence. Her own space to lock or leave open as she chose. It wasn't just a room, it was proof. Proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she was building something real. Ethan visited often, sometimes doing homework at her desk just to be near her. Riley still kept her backpack, still packed it every night out of habit, but slowly she stopped sleeping with her shoes on. And that, in its quiet way, was a victory. The beginning still hurt. The past didn't erase itself just because a news story had started. There were nights when Riley woke up and had to remind herself where she was. Days when she almost walked out without locking the door, a habit from a life where nothing was yours long enough to protect. But now, for the first time, there was a door, a key, a place, not perfect, not painless, but real. Every scar she carried came with her, but so did her strength. The Northbridge project opened quietly, not with a gala, but with intention. Kids showed up. Some stayed. Some ran. Riley understood both, and every time a new one came in, she knew what it cost to walk through that door. She greeted them like she wished someone had once greeted her, with no judgment, just space. And when she filled out the paperwork, she wrote her name with confidence. Because now she had something no system could erase, a place to fall, and a place to rise. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 9, Letters Never Sent, and I'll continue with the same level of depth and care. It started as a way to stay sane. Writing was never something Riley had been taught to do in any formal sense, no structured journaling or school essays. But somewhere along the way, she'd learned that putting words on paper gave her control over the chaos in her head. So she started writing letters. Not emails. Not texts. Handwritten, ink-on-paper letters, with no intention of sending them. Some were addressed to people who were gone. Her mom, mostly, sometimes kind, sometimes furious, sometimes just full of silence. Other letters were written to kids she'd met in shelters or on sidewalks, Leo, who used to hoard peanut butter packets, Trina, who sang lullabies to herself when no one was listening, and then there were the ones she wrote to herself, her younger self to be exact. The little girl with bloody knees and clenched fists who thought survival was the same as strength. Riley wrote to all of them. When the pain was too much to say out loud, she wrote. When something good happened and she didn't know how to celebrate it, she wrote. The letters lived in a worn shoebox under her bed, tucked beneath notebooks and paperwork. Safe. Sacred. Sacred. She never told anyone about the letters. They weren't meant to be shared. They were raw, some messy, some unreadable, some filled with scribbles or tear stains. Writing them was like lancing a wound, painful but necessary. Sometimes she ended the letters with questions. Sometimes she ended them mid-sentence, too overwhelmed to finish. And yet she kept writing. Every week she added more. It became a ritual. On Saturdays she carved out time for it, shutting her door and pulling out old receipts, scraps of paper, anything she could use when notebooks ran low. No one asked what she was doing, no one pried, until one afternoon when she came back from a community meeting and found the door to her room slightly open. Her heart dropped, not from fear but from exposure. Sitting on the floor back against the bed was Ethan. He had the shoebox in his lap. One of the letters was open in his hands. His face was quiet, unreadable at first. Then she saw it, his lower lip trembling, his eyes red. But he wasn't sobbing. He was crying the way people do when they're reading something that tells the truth too clearly. What are you doing?" Riley asked, more surprised than angry. Ethan looked up slowly, folding the letter with care before putting it back in the box. "Sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." She exhaled, walked over, and sat beside him. "I didn't think anyone would ever read those." He glanced at her, then back at the box. "I didn't know people could write like that," he said. "Like how it really feels, not just what they think they're supposed to say." Riley didn't respond right away. She felt exposed, like someone had cracked open her chest and peeked inside. "Which one did you read?" she asked. "The one to Leo," he said. "The part where you said you still remember the way he laughed, even though you were both starving." Riley nodded. "He was the only one who could make me laugh back then." Ethan reached into the box again, gently this time, as if touching something sacred. "You write things I feel but don't know how to say," he said softly. That made her look at him, really look. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not just sadness, recognition. The kind that only came from shared survival. Later that evening, Graham noticed Ethan was unusually quiet at dinner, not withdrawn but deep in thought, a trait Graham recognized well. After dinner, he found his son sitting alone on the stairs, still clutching one of the folded letters. "What's that?" Graham asked. Ethan didn't speak right away. "It's Riley's. I found it in her room. She let me keep this one." Graham hesitated. "Should you be reading that?" "It helped," Ethan said simply. "She says things I didn't know how to talk about." Graham held out his hand. "Can I see?" Ethan handed it over. Graham unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was tight, rushed in some parts, meandering in others. It wasn't neat, but it was honest. He read the whole thing, standing there on the stairs. Then he asked, "Are there more?" Ethan nodded. "A whole box. She hides it under her bed." Graham didn't ask for permission. He waited until later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, and gently knocked on Riley's door. She opened it halfway, confused and guarded. "I read one of your letters," he said. "May I read more?" She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. There was no ceremony to it, no need for speeches. Graham sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling one letter after another from the shoebox. Riley didn't hover. She just sat across from him, her back against the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. For a while, the only sounds were the quiet unfolding of paper and the occasional breath catching in his throat. Some letters were brief, just a paragraph. Others were pages long. One was a drawing of two hands almost touching but never quite connecting. Graham didn't rush. He read every word. And as he did, something inside him cracked open. He hadn't cried since Angela died. Not really. Not in a way that counted, but now the tears came, quietly, steadily, without shame. Riley watched him but didn't comment. She didn't need to. In her letters, she had already said everything. These weren't just fragments of her pain. They were windows into the girl she had been, the girl who had survived, and the woman she was becoming. By the time he closed the final letter, his hands were trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said. Not as a father, not as a benefactor. Just as a man who'd finally understood something he never could before. And so, in the silence that followed, Graham let himself feel what he had kept buried for too long, not just the loss of his wife, but the ache of trying to fill a void with structure, rules, and spreadsheets. Riley hadn't replaced Angela. That would have been impossible. But she had brought something back into the house that had been missing for years. Truth. Raw, imperfect, unapologetic truth. And through her words, Ethan had found language for his wounds. Graham had found a new kind of grief. Not for what he lost, but for what he almost missed. That night he sat with Riley on the floor for a long time, not needing to fill the space with talk. Just presence. Just understanding. And when he left, he didn't take any of the letters with him. He didn't need to. They had already done their work. For the first time since his wife's death, he let himself cry. Not for the past, but for what he had now found. A family born not of blood, but of choice. 2 years later, Riley stood before a modest stage at Millennium Park, staring out at a small crowd gathered for something most of them didn't fully understand. But she did. Every single inch of the place mattered. This wasn't just an event. It was an arrival. 2 years of planning, fundraising, late-night meetings, compromises, fights, and breakthroughs had brought her here. The Northbridge Center, part shelter, part school, part safe place for kids who didn't belong anywhere, was finally real. It had classrooms and bunk rooms, counselors and kitchen staff, even a rooftop garden that Riley had fought hard for. "They need to see something grow," she'd said during the design phase, "even if it's just tomatoes." Now the ribbon stretched across the entrance, and standing beside her was Ethan, 10 years old now, in a navy blazer that didn't quite fit. He held the ceremonial scissors with both hands, eyes wide but proud. She leaned down and whispered, "You ready?" He nodded solemnly. "Are you?" She smiled and stepped back. He cut the ribbon in one clean motion, and a quiet cheer rippled through the audience. She didn't cry, but her throat closed so tightly it hurt. After the ribbon was cut, there were brief speeches, short, purposeful, nothing flashy. A few donors spoke, a caseworker or two, and finally the mayor, who mispronounced Riley's name but looked genuinely moved. Graham never took the mic. He stood off to the side in a simple coat, no entourage, no fanfare. That was intentional. He had made the introductions, opened the doors, built the back-end infrastructure, but he never asked for credit. He had insisted Riley take the final spot on the program. "This is your voice," he'd said. "Not mine." When she stepped up to the podium, she gripped the edges tight, not from nerves, but to stay grounded. She glanced at Ethan, then at Graham, then out into the crowd, a few journalists, several teens from the pilot program, and scattered strangers who'd shown up out of curiosity. She cleared her throat, voice steady. "I know what it's like to sleep near a dumpster. I know what it's like to think no one sees you." She paused. "This place means you were wrong. You were always seen, just didn't know where to look." No dramatic applause followed, just stillness. And that, to her, meant they heard her. After the ceremony, while most people moved indoors for the tour and refreshments, Riley stayed back, lingering outside with Ethan. He ran his fingers across the carved plaque near the entrance. "Northbridge Center. A place to begin. Is it weird?" he asked. "Being here again?" Riley tilted her head. "A little," she admitted. "Last time I was here, I found you. Or maybe you found me." "Both," he said quickly. "We found each other." She smiled and ruffled his hair. It wasn't lost on her that the same park where she had once hidden behind dumpsters with a stolen cereal bar was now the site of her greatest accomplishment. "Think the old Riley would believe this happened?" he asked. She thought about it. "No," she said honestly. "She probably would have run the second someone handed her the keys." "But you didn't," he said, locking eyes with her. "You stayed." She knelt so they were face to face. "Because you waited for me," she said. That changed everything, and it had. Every milestone they'd passed, every grant approved, every kid who walked through their doors had grown from that one unmovable fact: he had waited. Back at the house, the mood was quieter, more reflective. The noise and attention of the day faded behind them like a chapter ending, and what remained was something more intimate, not success, but stability. Something that had taken Riley years to even believe was possible. Ethan kicked off his shoes at the door and ran to grab a juice box, still buzzing from the event. Graham entered behind her, setting his phone on silent without checking it. "You did well today," he said, his voice even but warm. Riley shrugged. "Didn't fall on my face." "That's something." "It's more than something," he replied. Then after a pause, "I'm proud of you." She froze for a second, not because she doubted him, but because she realized how long she had waited to hear those exact words from anyone. "Thanks," she said quietly, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wandered into the living room, where sunlight spilled through the tall windows, painting soft streaks across the floor. It was late afternoon, the hour between noise and rest. She walked to the fireplace and looked up at the photos that lined the mantel. Ethan at school, a Northbridge flyer, a drawing someone had gifted her. There was one spot left, right in the center, a blank space that had been waiting, she realized now, for today. Riley reached into her tote and pulled out a newly framed photo. It was from earlier that morning, snapped before the ceremony began. The three of them, Graham, Ethan, and her, standing side by side, not perfectly posed, not polished, just real. Ethan's tie was crooked. Graham wasn't smiling, but looked less haunted than he used to. And Riley herself had the kind of expression she never saw in photos. Rooted, sure. She placed the frame in the center of the mantel, adjusting it slightly until it stood straight. Then she stepped back, took it in, and exhaled. No fanfare, no speeches, just a quiet click of presence. The recognition that this was no longer borrowed space. It was hers, theirs. A home not built of survival, but of choice and commitment and change. Ethan wandered in, juice box in hand, and looked at the new photo. "Looks good there," he said. "Yeah," Riley agreed. "It does." She didn't need to explain it. And when they returned home in the living room lit by the late afternoon sun, she placed a new photo above the fireplace, the three of them, the new family, where winter ends. We pour our heart into every story we share, not just to tell something beautiful, but to connect with you. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. It's your support that keeps us going and allows us to bring more meaningful stories like this to life. Explore more of our videos. Each one is crafted with care and inspired by real emotions. And please leave us a comment below. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Together, we're building something special here.